Have you ever headed out into nature in search of peace and rejuvenation, but instead found yourself frozen in fear, faced with something you never expected to see and may never understand? Maybe you heard a strange noise on the breeze, or you saw a shadow moving between the trees. Maybe you saw something strange in the lake and wondered, what the hell am I seeing? By all means, take a walk, but for goodness sake, take care. Hello, welcome back for episode 4 of Graham's Haunted Life. This week we're going to talk about nature, more specifically about those times where you step out into nature and that little trip takes a turn for the worse. I've had a few things happen to me whilst walking about in nature, and we'll get into a couple of examples shortly, but I want to start by talking about one of my favourite subgenres in the world of horror, and that is rural horror. If it's set in a rural environment, I'm probably going to enjoy it. And classic examples of rural horror that I've really enjoyed throughout my life would be Friday the 13th, The Blair Witch Project, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre might well be the most visceral horror experience that I've ever had in my life. I saw that film for the first time in 1999 when it was given an official VHS release here in the UK. Now, I was 11, but I picked it up in this shop, and I can't remember which shop it was now, in a local shopping centre. I picked it up in this shop and I took it to the counter, and the guy just took my money, no questions. He just sold me a copy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I was 11. My mum didn't ask any questions about what I'd bought with my pocket money, and I watched this film when I got home, and it lit something up in my mind whilst simultaneously terrifying the life out of me to the point where I couldn't watch it again for a short while after. I left that viewing experience feeling like I had just watched the most gory film ever created. And really, it isn't that gory. It's all suggested, and it's absolute genius. Now, that setting, a group of young people out in the rural areas of Texas, happening to cross paths with this family of absolute loonies. That trope in horror, it's a standard now. It is, it's used and done to death now. I mean, I mentioned Friday the 13th. They did it to death within their own franchise, never mind it being done to death within horror in general. But the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was quite an early example of it, and it's so perfectly done. So perfect. Now, for a film entitled The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there's, I believe, only one scene where you actually see a chainsaw cut human flesh, and that is the moment where Leatherface falls over whilst he's chasing the main character, and the chainsaw bites into his own thigh a little bit. I may be wrong, but I'm sure that is the only point in that film where you actually see a chainsaw cut a person. You have it suggested to you, but you don't actually see it. And a lot of the things that happen in that film, you feel like you've seen a certain thing, but you haven't really. You've just had it masterfully suggested to you. I think the real thing that makes an impact in that film is sound. You get punished by sound throughout that film. The sound of Leatherface when he screams as he comes through that door and hits the kid in the head with a hammer and then slams that door shut. That sound lives on in your memory. The sound of the chainsaw whirring away lives on in your memory. The entire second half of the film, you get punished with the sound of the main female character screaming. She screams for pretty much the entire second half of that movie. And it really, really gets you. That's why I say it's one of the most visceral horror viewing experiences I've ever had in my entire life. But I want to bring it back to the UK now with an old film set in a rural environment, an old folk horror film called The Blood on Satan's Claw. Now, I saw this film, I think maybe around 10 years ago. I'd always heard about it. I'd always loved The Wicker Man, and I'd seen The Witchfinder General, and there's this third film, The Blood on Satan's Claw. They always get lumped together and spoken about as the Unholy Trinity. And about 10 years ago, I finally got a copy of The Blood on Satan's Claw, and it's now my favourite of the three. It's so earthy, and it showcases the British countryside so well. It shows just how beautiful the British countryside can be, and it also shows how creepy the British countryside can be. And the director, I remember watching the documentary, and the director spoke about wherever possible, the cameras were set right down on the ground because he wanted to suggest all of the horror in this film was coming from the earth. And he wanted the camera to be as close to the earth as possible. A brilliant film, an absolutely brilliant film, in which the local children of this rural community are being taken one by one into this cult of satanic sort of rites and rituals. It's absolutely brilliant. And the end part is, I'm not going to give any spoilers away about the ending, but the end part is about as cool as a sort of folk horror piece can be. So that sort of sets up the conversation for the day, the fact that I really love rural horror. I'm going to get into talking about some examples of times I have stepped out into nature and things have gone a little bit wrong. Now, the place where I grew up, it was surrounded by farmland and woodland and little streams here and there. Now, there was a stream that ran down the back of where I lived, and we called it the Beck. And a little bit further along this stream was like a patch of woodland that we always referred to as the Beck Forest. And it wasn't a forest, it was just a relatively small patch of woodland. But we would use this place as our playground for, all of our school holidays and weekends and stuff. We would play hide and seek in these woods. We would build camps. This one particular day we were playing hide and seek, and it was my turn to seek. Now, there's one path into this patch of woodland. The rest of it is fenced off around the perimeter and surrounded by fields where farmers kept cows and horses. So there's one path in and one path out, unless you would hop a fence and cross one of the farmers' fields. But we never did that because we were always told, the farmer would shoot you with hot rice if you walked across his fields. This one particular day, it was my turn to seek, and I stood at the beginning of the path into the trees. I counted to 100 and let my friends go and hide, and then I set off into the trees. And you come to this point where the path becomes really straight for a little distance. And as I rounded the corner onto that straight patch of path, at the opposite end of it, there was a man stood there, and he was just staring in my direction. He had a long green coat on. Now, I'm not saying that this man was in any way a creep or had any sort of bad intentions. I'm just saying that it shocked me to see a man stood there, considering we'd been playing in these trees pretty much all day and nobody else had come in and out, and there was just that one path in and out. I didn't see a dog with the guy, but he could potentially have just been a person walking his dog, and his dog may have been off in amongst the trees. It's more than likely that that man was purely innocent, but it just terrified me at that moment, and I turned and ran out of the trees, shouting to all of my friends, "There's a weird man in the trees." Like, eventually, a lot of my friends began to come out onto the path and out of the woodland, asking me what the hell I was talking about. At no point did this man ever come along the path and walk out. You know, never ever saw him again. I only saw him in that one instance at the end of the path. Now it's potentially the farmer. He's potentially crossed one of his own fields and jumped over the fence into the trees to see what the hell us young kids were up to. That is a possibility. I'm not saying that this guy, whoever he was, had bad intentions. I'm only saying that it terrified me at the time when I was about 9 years old. Now, in the same patch of woodland, on another occasion, we were doing the same thing. We were playing hide and seek, and it was my turn to seek again. And as I was looking around in the trees, out of nowhere, a cow was just running towards me through the trees, and I absolutely crapped myself, and I took off running, and eventually got out of the trees, and other people were coming out of the trees and, saying, like, there's a cow running around in the trees. And it turned out that a piece of the fence further through the woodland was damaged, and cows were getting into the trees. But that moment where you're not expecting anything to happen, and I'm just searching for my friends in a game of hide and seek, and all of a sudden a big black and white cow is just running towards me through the trees. I could have just died on the spot. But that's sort of like, that's a little bit of a comic story, the sinister elements from the earlier story weren't there with that. It was just a cow that had gotten into the trees. Now, another story from the place where I grew up happened to a family that lived near me. They were going out for a walk as a family together, and I think it was the mother and her friend and their kids, their respective kids, going for a walk around what used to be the old railway lines. And there's a farm sort of set right next to these old railway lines. And you have to go nearly to the farm, and then you turn off and you get onto these public footpaths. And somewhere along the way, this family noticed that on pretty much every fence post and telegraph post and, pylon, there were dead crows and pigeons hanging upside down. And obviously the kids were young and they were terrified. And the parents who were taking the kids for a walk were in a bit of shock at finding, as you would be, at finding a load of dead crows and pigeons hung upside down. Now, it's common practice, or it used to be common practice in sort of rural areas, that farmers shoot these pests and hang them out on fence posts as a warning to, the others. It's not as common nowadays. It wasn't that common then. This was in the 90s. But that particular farmer still does it to this day. This family, or these two families essentially, weren't aware that this was a common practice. So they were just fully shocked. And I remember there was a story in the local newspaper at the time about this grisly walk, or this walk these families had taken, that it took this grisly turn. And remember that sort of story in the paper, and everybody everybody was buzzing about the fact that these kids who we all knew were in the paper, but that farmer still does that. Quite recently I've been there and I've seen crows hung upside down on the fences on his land. Now, apparently a crow understands that dead crow hung upside down is one of its kind. They understand that's a dead crow that's been killed and hung out. and it's meant to be a deterrent. I don't know whether there's actually any truth in that, whether crows do understand that or not, but that's why farmers do it. And I think they do the same with moles, although I've never seen moles hung out, but it was a common practice, and people used to get paid by farmers to kill moles and nail them up so that the farmer knew how much to pay them, you know. But yeah, in rural environments, people still have these strange habits. And as I said, that farmer still nails out dead crows hung upside down on fence posts, apparently as a deterrent. So a little bit later on in life, when I was sort of mid-teens, I was maybe 15, 16, I went for a walk a little bit further out from the village, but still in our local area. I went for a walk, and there's this road that leads down from this hill, and it's just a little road, and it eventually comes to a bigger road, but partway down it there's a tree that was known as the hanging tree. I've spoken about the hanging tree before, and about the fact that I would like to occasionally just go and have a look at it, because I just found that, like, that little reputation and that little story about this tree, I found it so cool. So I'd occasionally just go just to walk past the hanging tree. And this one particular day, as I was walking along the road that leads to it, I noticed a man behind me, but he was sort of keeping a specific distance between us. But always, when I turned back, it seemed as if he was looking at me. Now, I'm not saying that this man definitely had some sort of bad intentions, but I started to wise up to the fact that he could potentially be following me for some bad reason, and I'm just a young lad. So I got to this point where I went round a bend in the road where he could no longer see me, and I stopped, and I just turned around and looked back. And he came around the corner and noticed that I'd stopped, and he stopped. And he almost kind of tried to jump back out of sight. And at that point, I realised, okay, potentially this guy's totally innocent and he just doesn't want to interact with me, and that's why he's keeping his distance. But just as equally potential, this guy might want to do me some harm. So I just took off running, and I got down to the point where this little road meets up with the main road. And I walked back towards the village. And I thought, I'm not going to go wandering down there on my own anymore, because that was just a little bit too strange for me. As I say, he could potentially have just been keeping his distance because he didn't want to have to interact with anybody at all. But it seemed a bit odd to me, and that's why I took off running. Now, me and my wife, when we first got together, we had been out for the day somewhere, and for the last part of it, before we went home, we pulled up in Durham to have a walk around a place called Wharton Park. And as we were walking around this park, we both kept noticing this same man who, very similarly to the last little story, was keeping his distance but always looking at us. And it was so odd. And we began to say to each other, let's dip out of his sight now and walk to this other part of the park and wait. And each time we did that, he would turn up again, keeping his distance but looking at us. It was so strange. And after a while, we just decided, let's just go get in the car and go back to go back to your house. It was so odd. Now, I dread to think what that guy's intentions were, or if we had been like a young couple. I mean, at the time I was 35, and I'm 6 foot tall and quite a big man, And I don't know whether this guy was trying to work out, like, is this just a young couple? He probably got a decent view of me at a certain point and realised, oh, actually he's quite a big fella. But if that had just been a couple of teenage kids walking around, what was that guy's intentions? because he was definitely following us and definitely keeping an eye on us. It was so weird. And it wasn't as if he was like a groundskeeper at the park or anything like that. He wasn't in any kind of uniform. He was just a normal guy in normal clothes. And he was being very weird. Now I have one more example of something that happened to me on a walk that took place more recently than any of the other stories I've told. It took place last year. Now there were two instances, but in my head they were linked. So where I live now with my wife and our dog, there's a little road leading away from our street that's just lined by trees on one side and a hedgerow and a field on the other side. And I take the dog out every night at around about 10 o'clock for his last little walk before he gets put to bed. And this particular night last year in the February, I believe it was, obviously at 10 o'clock at night, it's pretty dark in February. I was just about to get to the point where the streetlights stop and it gets really dark, but I'm not that scared of the dark. I was just about to walk into the darkness and I heard a very deep guttural growling sound, and the dog snapped his head around to look in the direction of this sound at the same time that I did, and he didn't seem to want to keep walking. He didn't like it, and I didn't like it at all, and I very, very quickly pulled on the dog's leader and said, let's just go back to the street lights and I'll just walk him around the block, rather than walk down this dark road, because I have no idea what that sound was. And I'd started to tell myself, it was probably a badger, because I've found dead badgers at the side of the road around here where we live, unfortunately. But it was probably just a badger growling. That's what I was telling myself. Now skip forward a few months to June of last year, and at 10 o'clock at night it's still pretty light. I was walking the dog again at the same time, and this little stretch of road, it's pretty much straight along the edge of this little woodland, and I tend to take the dog to the end of that woodland and then turn back just for his last little walk. And as I turned back and I was walking along, something jumped out of the hedge onto the road and started walking along in the same direction as us. Now I thought, oh, it's one of the cats from our street, and I wasn't really looking. And then after a while I realised, oh, actually, out the corner of my eye, it's a bit bigger than a cat. Must be a fox. So I looked properly and I realised it's much bigger than a fox, and it's black. And at some point it must have heard me or the dog, or picked up our scent, and it turned its head 180 and looked at us, and I could see these sort of yellowish eyes. And then it turned and crossed the road and went into the trees, but it just did this really slowly. It didn't like bolt across the road. It just walked really slowly across the road and into the trees. And at that moment I realised what I was looking at was a massive black cat. I understand that could make me sound like an absolute lunatic. I never used to believe in the big cats in Britain kind of theory. But after that moment I couldn't deny it. That's what I'd seen. It was a massive black cat with a long tail that trailed down onto the floor, and it just walked across our path and into the trees, and it was gone. And I realised, like, I've got to walk past where that cat just was in order to get home. So I really hurried back with the dog. And when I got in the house, I told my wife, like, I'm swearing to you, I've just seen a big black cat. And I thought she was going to say, stop being stupid. But she said, I saw something on Facebook recently about a big black cat in County Durham. And I mean, there always have been reports of big black cats in the area. I never quite believed it until that moment. And I really do now. I have to, because it's what I saw. I then began to link the sound I heard in the February to the thing I saw in the dune. And that really, really sent a shiver up my spine when those two things linked up in my head, that perhaps I'd heard the growl of a big cat. It was really, really guttural. And I looked up examples on YouTube of like black panthers and the noises they make, and it was so identical to what I heard. So it was terrifying. That's kind of one of the most scary things that's ever happened to me out in the wilds. Well, it's not so much in the wilds, but it's a little walk in nature. We live in a rural setting now. Seeing this big black cat and realizing like that's a thing. I went on a podcast with a guy, a podcast called Big Cat Conversations with a guy called Rick Minter, and I told him my story. So in the description for this video, I will leave a link to that episode. My part in the episode started about 56 minutes in, I believe. And as I say, I realise telling you the story that I've seen a big black cat in the wild in Britain may make me look like a lunatic, but I don't care. It is what I saw, and it was very, very unnerving, very scary. There were lots of deer in the area, lots of foxes, lots of rabbits, lots of hares. So if there's a big black cat living in this area, it has lots of food. Now, with all that talk about the nature of fear out the way, it's time to talk about a little bit of music. We like to talk about a bit of music on Graham's Haunted Life. The record of the week this week is the third album by British band The Horrors. The album is called Skying. The first album by The Horrors was kind of like erratic, electro-infused indie punk kind of sound. The second album was much more of a post-punk kind of sound, a little bit of that erratic sound had been taken out of the mix. But this third album went very much down a shoegazy kind of path, shoegaze and dream pop. And I believe they recorded it by themselves in their own purpose-built studio. I do remember hearing the first single, Still Life, on the radio in 2011 and thinking, oh, when that album comes out, I really need to get a copy of it straight away. I was really intrigued, and once I got the album, the opening track, Changing the Rain, really set this tone, and I knew as soon as I heard that opening track, this is going to be a favourite album of mine. The way in which Forrest Badman's vocals interact with the music that's being played is just perfect. As I said, there's a dream pop kind of element to it, there's a shoegazy kind of element to it. Occasionally, vocal wise, there's a bit of a David Bowie type of vibe going on. With the tracks that I really like off this album, You Said, absolutely brilliant track, and I love the chorus of that. I love the vocal delivery on that track. There's a track called Endless Blue, which the guitar kind of picks up a little bit. In that one, there's a bit more of a defined, like a discernible riff, with a bit of distortion, compared to the main theme of this album being this ethereal kind of like dream poppy thing where the drive tends to be keys rather than a guitar riff. But yeah, on that track Endless Blue, there's a definite guitar riff. Yeah, I believe the band are from Southend-on-Sea, and this album came out in 2011 on XL Recordings, and it's been my record of the week. I've been playing it inside and out. Yeah, I'm going to wrap the episode up here. Now, I've decided that the way I'm going to do things is every Monday at 8 PM on YouTube, there will be a new episode of Graham's Haunted Life. And then there may be occasionally during the week a separate thing that I record, but I'm not quite sure what to do with that yet. So for the time being, 8 PM every Monday, there will be a new episode of Graham's Haunted Life. Thanks for listening, and I'll meet you back here next week.